Sonic always had a story. From the very beginning of Sonic's existence, the creators thought of a story for Sonic involving him literally being part of a series of storybooks written by some random person from the 1940s as a backstory for why the classic game's settings exist. But some people would have begged to differ. For a while in the 90s, maybe even since the Sega Saturn came out, there was growing resentment for the newer games, especially considering the consumers for the Sega Saturn were informed that the newer console would be underpowered and not really be able to handle 3D games. So as you can imagine, that will mean those customers for the service will be unhappy if they didn't get more of the 2D stuff like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and by the time of the Dreamcast release, it was too late to grab those customers who felt that they had been lied to back into Sega's market. By the time Sega went fully third party, many fans were indifferent to the change because they had already moved on, but some fans were definitely disappointed. I'm not sure how many stayed and continued to be disappointed afterward because, well, I wasn't there. This is secondhand information from all the content I've seen about it. Correct me on some of the info if you feel as though I'm wrong, though, because I wasn't there. But I know it wasn't just one person, since they eventually collectively complained enough for Sega to listen to them, especially whenever 06 came out. That was the boiling point for classic Sonic fans who were fed up with the way Sega was treating Sonic at the time. One fan who was definitely part of that group made a song called Sonic Doesn't Need a Story, which sort of became the anthem for classic Sonic fans then. Their resentment was even louder after that. This eventually led to Sega adding 2D back into the 3D games and making the poorly received follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, even though Adventure 1 kind of already did that, at least in terms of story. Old fans weren't quite happy with that, though. They needed something more, and eventually they got it with Sonic Colors and especially Generations, because Sonic was back to the way they remembered, even though those games still technically had stories. So why does this matter? It directly parallels something I'm seeing in the Sonic community now more than ever. With Sonic Colors released, there were some fans who became dissatisfied with the new direction the series was heading, specifically the fans who grew up with the games from the 2000s. A lot of them were won back over with Generations, but eventually stopped caring because of Sonic Boom until Sonic Forces was advertised as a return to a more serious direction for the series. Spoiler, it wasn't what they wanted. I know I said I was okay with it. You know what? No. Let me rephrase that. The stories existed and did the job they needed to for what they were in the 2010s. I never said they were good, and I'm actually glad they were criticized, even if it didn't seem like I was when I made the Meta Era video. I unfortunately feel like I wasted a few months making it now because of how much stuff I got wrong in it, but I digress. This was the boiling point for the 2000s fans who were fed up with the way Sega had been treating Sonic, which resulted in some of the video essays that talked about how Sonic is bad again because Sega appealed to the classic Sonic fans for too long, which I've kind of already talked about in my bad, quote, direct response to a 5-year-old video where I got a bunch of stuff wrong in. You know the thing where I said Jay's reviews said he doesn't care about the term anymore? I was wrong about that. He said at age 12, which really makes a lot of that video pointless, unfortunately. And as soon as I made that video, I got recommended clips of people using Meta as an acronym, including the god of YouTube himself, Mr. Beast, which would have been way more helpful 2 to 3 months before I finished making that video. And then I got recommended videos about Velma that said it's meta, and if that's meta, I hate Meta now. That show is terrible based on the first trailer alone, but that's besides the point. This eventually resulted in Sega kind of listening to the feedback. Their complaints weren't exactly about not appealing to Adventure Era fans, though. I think that's one of the more major things I may have got wrong about them, but I don't think I will be wrong to say some of the more rabid and toxic fans, but not all of them, did think that, which led me to believe they thought that as well somehow, especially with the reception to Frontiers being as positive it is, partially due to the story and people saying it fixed the characters. While I personally like all the references and stuff in it, I see why they don't, because it's basically the same as the classic Sonic stands positive reception to Colors compared to Adventure Era stuff, whatever Sonic tried afterward is to the 2000s fans. Does this really matter? No, not really. I'm not going to sit here and make the same mistake I did last time, trying to make a point out of nothing. Just thought it was interesting. I'm just surprised no 2000s Stan thought of this yet. We'll probably be back to this stage again in 10 years when Sonic is dying again, though I had no intention of wanting the stories to return to the 2010s when I made the Meta Era video, despite a lot of the stupid stuff I said in it. But I think it's going to happen anyway, considering how many people bully random people on Twitter for liking Sonic Forces, just like people bullied random people in 2000s for liking 06. I don't really care either way now. now, as long as the gameplay is decent, or at minimum okay, because in the Sonic game, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, gameplay comes first over story. It's just that better stories could be an added bonus to the games, and these added bonuses have always been present to an extent. Anyway, now I'm going to talk about why I think Sonic always had a story, historical context, and significance aside. Even outside of the storybook backstory I talked about in the beginning of the video, Sonic 1 had a story. The plot was to go defeat Eggman, and if you didn't get the Chaos Emeralds while you did it, you would get the bad ending. But if you got them, you would get the good ending and save the animals from Robotnik. But what I didn't mention was that while you did it, there was a ton of environmental storytelling along the way to the end of the game. Same thing goes for basically every other classic Sonic game, including Mania. And even some of the more questionable entries then, besides maybe Sonic the Fighters, that one had a story, kind of, without environmental storytelling. The Sonic Adventure series and subsequent entries after all had stories with voice dialogue, usually, even if they were not as good as they could be sometimes. Some of them even kind of went back to the idea that Sonic was just a part of a series of storybooks. I used to be angry about not getting the same type of stories from the Adventure era, but after actually playing some of those games, I realized I really didn't like the ones after Adventure 1. I tried to see why people liked them, but I personally just found them not as appealing as a lot of the fandom says they are. I think the reason people like them so much is the variety of characters people got to play as in them, and how they were all part of a big grandiose story though, and I can see why on that at least. That and subsequent entries up until 06 seem to follow a chronological order where every story somewhat interconnects with the last. Every story afterward will be pretty disconnected from any event that happened before or after 06, admittedly up until Sonic Generations or Sonic Forces, depending on which one you believe had a better story, because they actually did try to bring villains from the past entries, specifically in the 2010s, together in a big grandiose story, seemingly even bigger than SA2, and technically it was. Eggman took over the world for the first time within the game universe with the help of a magical item and new enemy that beat up Sonic and won at first, with a small resistance fighting back against his forces like the Freedom Fighters, except admittedly the Eggman taking the world plot with the Freedom Fighters, specifically in Sad AM, the cartoon, not the comic, is a little better than Force's version, to me at least. Force's version had a bunch of past villains and even used a self-insert protagonist from the Resistance thing, just not as effectively as it could have. Then there's Frontiers, where a lot of the story was references to past games, but also had a plot about demon monsters being aliens and Eggman's AI creation firing balls of light at the moon and stuff, so there are a bunch of different interpretations of Sonic's story in the games. That's not even mentioning all the external mediums Sonic has been a part of outside of games, like that one manga no one cares about, all the comics, and all of the cartoons. So yeah, I feel like that proves Sonic always had a story, at least to some extent. If I would have made this video like 5 years ago, I would have probably just complained about not having the same kind of stories as the Adventure era because I was a stupid kid, or more like early teenager, who wanted to believe the people saying 06 isn't exactly that bad, guys, people, and when I played it, I thought it sucked for the most part, and was actually really similar to Forces in terms of story and how much automation was used. Considering I played both at the same time, if you're a new Sonic fan and for whatever reason this happens to be the first video you ever see about Sonic, don't listen to either me or anyone ever saying a game is not that bad in the Sonic community and go off and try to buy either Forces or 06 or whatever game is considered bad at some point in the fandom, but later not as bad, because both Boost era and Adventure era fans' opinions suck, and you should form your own opinion about those games accordingly if you ever do happen to buy into them. The video's over for those of you who don't care about the channel, don't want to subscribe even though you watched to this point, or going to subscribe and still going to go back and unsubscribe over that meta era video. After I said I was mostly wrong about it, like last time, I feel like I've said I was wrong about it in every video since I made it, so I'm going to try to not mention it in the next video because eventually people are going to get tired of it. Every time I make one of these, I feel like I'm being watched, and not in a good way, in the schizophrenic, paranoid kind of way. So for whatever reason I do end up stopping uploading seemingly permanently in the future, that's why. Not saying that it will happen like that, because I've already said I still have other stuff to say, just that if it ever does happen, don't be surprised. That in college, because YouTube isn't exactly a real job, nor do I want it to be. Unless I, for whatever reason, have to make it one, and it's not stable at all for almost any sort of career path, even whenever you start getting paid. But if anyone needs an editor that you would actually pay though, and tell me how you will pay me, hopefully with a flat fee per video, please ask somewhere, whether in the Discord, email, or comments. I'll see it the fastest in the comments, but would prefer a follow-up in either the Discord or the business email. Don't think asking for work like that is considered e-begging on the internet. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Also, please tell me if my audio is a little better in the comments, because I was told it was bad last time. Also, if I mention my family in videos again, please tell me to shut up about it in the comments, because no one cares. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.